have some assessment system, which we don't currently have. So we respond to behaviors or social emotional needs pretty much as like a one for, that kid's having an issue, we go in, try to do things. What we want to do is create a systematic framework so that everyone knows what that next level of response should be. And yes, there is specific curriculum that supports social emotional learning, but what we really want in an ideal situation is that your social emotional learning is actually embedded into your academic programming. So there may be some lessons that are utilized, say, through responsive classroom to help support where rituals and routines or whatever those focuses may be. And then we have hopefully 80% of our students who are responding well. For those who maybe need a little bit extra, maybe I am pulling out some very specific lessons on what does it mean to be a good friend, or what do I do when I get angry, or what do I do when I'm sad, or so it's embedded into your day ideally as not a separate curriculum. However, there is curriculum to help support those in needs.
Okay, following what you're saying. Okay, now specifics. Okay, there's when you have a discussion with the students, and you're talking about things, for example, prejudices. You talk about things like thoughts. How do you engage the student in such a way? You have to ask them about their prejudice and thoughts in the classroom setting.
Perhaps.
Or are you?
I would say that we're responding as needs sort of arise. We already have things like advisory, say, at the middle school, and these kinds of things I would think become part of a regular discussion. I'm not really sure how to answer that in particular, Mr. Odell. But topics do come up, and there may be, say at the elementary school, they may be using a certain story or literacy or literature book that they present a topic such as you ask. And then what do we do? And then discussion ensues, So I don't know if that kind of answers your question.
Can I be a little more pointed on this, because I deal with people who think this way, and I need to have an answer, okay? And it's a very serious problem that I'm having with people that I talk in public, with dealing with public education, okay? And they talk about this particular area. I can only put it this way, and I apologize for being too pointed, that I can go someplace with a person physically, and I reach a point where that person doesn't feel comfortable, and I violate that person physically, okay? This here, I talk to people who say, wait a minute, you can go someplace mentally with the person in a classroom setting, and they don't feel comfortable with where they're being taken in the classroom setting. In the same sense, I can now violate that person emotionally or mentally.
I think we need to be really careful when we approach things like that. I think that we need to be really sensitive about different folks' views and points of view. The bottom line is we're going to look at those 5 competencies. And so, yeah, I may feel this way or that way about a particular topic that might not be popular. But then how do I work within the community setting, whether it's my classroom, my family, or the larger community, because maybe I don't have the same view as somebody else. And how do I present that, and how do I feel comfortable about that?
But then also, how do you make the student feel comfortable participating? If perhaps you're taking that student in a direction and sort of saying, I really don't want to start sharing myself in the classroom.
I think that's okay. I think we have to be really respectful of what folks are comfortable with.
And accepting, I think.
And that's one of the competencies, actually, that we are self-aware, that we are respectful of others. and what their beliefs may be.
Yeah, I got one more, Jim, while you're here. Some of these things, boy, they're tough for adults, you know.
Absolutely.
Well, the concept for empathy, you know, empathy and sympathy are two different things.
And I think that, yeah, and the hardest thing to do is to measure those things.
Yeah.
And that's why we say that, you know, we don't have perfect community and social, emotionally developed schools, classrooms, families, because these are things that we learn for a lifetime. I don't know that anyone is ever completely finished with that list of competencies. I know certainly I am not. So we start where we are, and we work from there.
Okay, but you know, I mean, there are folks who they spend a lifetime dealing
Absolutely.
with empathy, and they don't achieve it in 99% of their relationships. It just doesn't happen.
I think there's a difference between knowing what that is cognitively and academically and being able to actually act upon that in a socially acceptable way. We don't always ingrain those, that external versus that internal nature about certain things.
Yeah, I mean, there's certain high achievable things here that are very difficult, like as for even adults, and I give you guys credit, you should teach them to children, you know? Like this other one here, a resilient attitude to growth even in the face of adversity and challenges. Good luck, 99% of the adult population with that one.
Well, like we didn't write the Common Core state standards, we didn't write these social emotional standards. There's some folks out in Indiana or Indianapolis that are responsible for those. Anything that you might want to know, I would encourage you to go on the CASEL website. It's CASEL, and it's actually in the PowerPoint, just to kind of explore and see that this is not a small undertaking. This is a lot, and as schools and why this has been taken on by the education community is that we know that it needs to go out to the larger community as well. And we need to bring in community partners to help us develop these things.
I guess, you know, one of my faults, I'll tell you, is that from time to time I put on my Mr. Rogers cardigan sweater and sneakers, and I get very concerned about that child in the classroom who's sitting there very quietly and not really sharing just how uncomfortable they are in a particular discussion or something.
So one of the things that I mentioned earlier is that it's important for us to have some universal screener. We all can identify the student who's out of their seat, making noise, you know, all of those kinds of overt, but we can't necessarily identify that student that you are describing. And hopefully through this universal screener, we will be able to pick up on some of those nuances. All of that is still in exploration stages in terms of what we will use. We talked about it this morning actually at our cabinet meeting, and how we will address that. There are some recommended measures from the state, and so we're looking at what will work for us here in Bristol Warren. You have to remember, please, that we are at the infancy stages. We are building a framework which begins with a mission and a vision, and getting everybody to kind of buy in and support that mission and vision, and then to make it also known to everybody. So as Dr. Andre fully supported our work with RTI and DBI, you know, we talked about how we'll enter into the new school year with a focus on social emotional as well as our academic supports for students.
Yeah, I know you guys are sensitive to it, like, don't misunderstand. That I know you look for these things, but like you said, there are certain students that just aren't going to give you the cues unless you know to look for the very subtle nuance in that particular person, because they're not going to give you the traditional cue.
One of the things that is particular to these assessments is that, like, maybe pre-K, K1, the teachers are filling them out, but maybe from grade 2 or 3 up, it's the student actually participating in that assessment. And so we'll have to see what kind of data that's going to yield for us.
So I'm just going to add to Mr. Hotel's comments, is that as a district, we're trying to build coherence. So several months ago now, we had Mr. Driscoll present around personalized learning. So if you can remember his presentation, how students had voice and choice in how they presented their academics or behavior. Now couple this with Leslie's presentation. So how do we see the two programs working hand in hand? And so that we're trying to get coherence between all our programs so that students don't feel isolated and they have multiple ways to actually interact with the trusted adult. And so if you take the SEL standards, the DBI, the NCII, and then you couple that on top of personalized learning, is that we're hoping that we're meeting the needs of all students. So there's a lot of work going on, and our task is that it's not overwhelming. So where's the coherence and clarity and where we want to go? So it's, although there's different months that we're presenting a lot of the work, as Leslie said, even in this morning in our cabinet discussion, we talked about the interactions and the overlap between all the initiatives, which still go back to 4 kind of essential questions. What do we want all kids to know and be able to do? How are we going to measure it? What are we going to do if they don't get it? And what are we going to do if they do? So there is a lot of coherence between it and a lot of the presentations by our directors and the work. So that if a student, as you described, is in a second grade classroom, and we don't feel he's being reached in a traditional way, that there's also through technology or another venue, that he still has a voice in that classroom and can interact.
Thank you.
Thank you, always a pleasure. Oh, I'm
I
sorry.
had a couple.
Sure.
No, I'm sorry.
You're trying to
No,
cut
I
off my
wasn't.
questions.
I'm sorry. No, I wasn't.
Back
I didn't see you.
a couple slides back, you had the 3-tier, and you talked about the 80, 15, 5. What assessments do you use to determine whether or not they're in the 80, the 15, and the 5, and how often are those assessments given? It sounds like we don't really have a universal screener.
Not for
SEL.
social emotional, right?
For
Right.
SEL.
Didn't exist.
Right.
It hasn't existed. This is a fairly new phenomenon.
So the screener, or the assessment that you're giving for the 80, 15, 5 is a purely academic assessment?
Correct. And that's our benchmarks 3 times a year in math and reading and writing, and that's through Diane's and Mary's offices. And so then once the teachers or our principals receive that, then if you go into any of our schools at any given point in time, ask to see the data wall.
The data wall?
Data wall, W-A-L-L, yep.
Okay.
And so from that, they look at every single student and post every single student on the data wall and where they performed in regard to those assessments. From there, we then go to implement our system. All right, so that comes first.
Yep.
Then targeted instruction, and we kind of divide the kids depending on how they score. Thank you. According to how they score, and then we work from there. And so it is 3 times a year for those major benchmark assessments. And then in between, kids that may be in that tier 2 and tier 3, those tier 2, their progress monitored about once a month. So we're continuously looking at them in between those 3 times a year benchmarks. And then in the ones in the red, we're looking at bi-weekly. We meet on them monthly and make decisions based on what the data tells us, and we meet as a team in each one of the schools.
Now, when we have an SEL universal screener assessment, whatever you want to call it, is that going to also be is that going to follow along with the kind of the academic benchmarks that it's a three times a year?
It is a 3 time, yes, it is.
Once we have something
Yeah.
implemented.
We actually have assessments, say for tier 2 and tier 3. We don't have that universal screener. Like I said, it didn't exist.
Right.
So they're building them. You know, I've looked at a few. They're exorbitantly expensive and complicated, and you know, not something that I would necessarily recommend for every classroom teacher. So.
Any other questions?
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you, always a pleasure.
Thank you, Leslie. I still wish you would have sang before we started.
Now, come to church.
I make a motion to adjourn.
Motion made to adjourn. Ms. Campbell, second. Right. Ms. Reyes, all in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Meeting is adjourned.